Hey everybody, this week we are all about high fantasy. Now that term sounds like it might have something to do with the quality of the writing, which would be an understandable mistake, but it actually has to do with the setting of a story rather than the quality of the writing. So high fantasy is probably the most widely recognized form of the fantasy genre, and when we think about high fantasy, I'm willing to bet that most of us think of things like wizards, dragons, epic quests, things like that. Also, the story takes place in another world, which is also called a secondary world. And those are the defining features of high fantasy. One of my friends used to call it the pack your saddlebags with bread and hard cheese and go on a quest kind of story, and she's not wrong. But the biggest point to remember for high fantasy is that it's set in a place that's not Earth. So some examples of high fantasy novels would be the Game of Thrones books by George R. R. Martin, The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, or The Kingkiller Chronicles by Brandon Sanderson. If you've read any of those or are familiar with that, that is definitely high fantasy. So you might be wondering, if there's a high fantasy, is there a corresponding low fantasy? And the answer to that is yes. Low fantasy, by contrast, tends to be set on Earth, and it's recognizable as Earth. It's just that magic intrudes in some way upon reality or regular life, and it's not seen as something normal by most people. It's actually also called intrusion fantasy as well as low fantasy. Some people might also call it magical realism, but that genre is slightly different and the two don't always mesh perfectly, even though magical realism is a subgenre of fantasy. Some authors of magical realism are Alice Hoffman, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende, and Neil Gaiman, even though he tends to just defy genres in general, so he can fit into a lot of different places. Low fantasy is still set in the real world, on Earth, and magic and supernatural elements exist in some way, but those elements usually have their own separate world with its own rules that's different from reality, even if it is set on Earth. So probably the most famous example of low fantasy is Harry Potter. Definitely low fantasy. Also, some people say that Lord of the Rings is low fantasy as well, and I think that a good argument could be made for that because Tolkien intended for it to be a mythic prehistory rather than necessarily something set on another world. But most people do list it as high fantasy rather than low fantasy. So I will be interested to hear what you guys think about that. High fantasy has historically been dominated by a pretty specific structure as well as characters who tend to be wealthy, white, and male. Luckily, a lot of the newer high fantasy novels have begun to move past that stereotype and are branching out a lot. There are still plenty of traditional bread and hard cheese kind of stories, but we are seeing a lot more diversity as well, both in the nature of the stories themselves and in the representation of characters as well as by the authors who are writing them. So fantasy now isn't really dominated quite so much by the wealthy white male characters anymore, which I think is a good thing. In fact, it was actually just in 2016 that a Black woman won the prestigious Hugo Award for her book, and that author was N.K. Jemisin, who I think I have mentioned before, and she won the Hugo for the best novel for her book, The Fifth Kingdom. That was the first time a Black woman had won the Hugo for best novel, and she proceeded to win the Hugo for best novel for the next 3 years in a row, and they were all for the books in her Broken Earth trilogy. That series, by the way, is awesome, and it's not your typical high fantasy story, though it certainly counts as such, and if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. So all fantasy, in one way or another, does give comfort to its readers. That's the genre that reinforces our hopes that good will always triumph over evil. Because of that, we often see an uptick in the number of fantasy novels that are written during and just after major social unrest or some kind of a major conflict like war. The Lord of the Rings, for example, was published just after World War II, but Tolkien began writing it in the 1920s and 30s just after the First World War ended, and he was a soldier in that conflict, and he was in the trenches, and a lot of the imagery that we see in his novels are directly related to that. So as we continue through the week, just think about some of the books that you've read, fantasy or otherwise, that have comforted you or that have been comfort reads for you. Maybe you reread them several times. So what is it about that book that you find comforting? Just think about what it is that you like about it. Why is it comforting? When was it written, and what might have been a factor in the creation of it? Figuring out those kinds of answers can help figure out also what was happening in the world that it was written, which again is an important part of literature regardless of genre. So as always, if you have any questions, send me a private message or send me a note to the public questions thread in the classroom, and I will see you there. Bye.